The winter wind howled through the streets of Chicago, biting at Harold Weber's cheeks as he pulled his thin coat tighter around his bony shoulders. At 78 years old, the cold seemed to seep deeper into his bones with each passing year. He shuffled along the sidewalk, his worn shoes sliding a bit on a patch of ice. Harold hadn't always walked with such uncertainty. There was a time when he moved with the confidence of someone who regularly commanded standing ovations. His fingers, now stiff and swollen with arthritis, had once danced across piano keys with such grace that audiences around the world had been moved to tears. But that was a lifetime ago, it seemed. As he passed by the glowing windows of shops and restaurants, he couldn't help but peek inside. Families and friends gathered around tables laden with steaming plates of food, laughing and talking without a care in the world. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Just a slice of bread with a scrape of peanut butter. 3 years ago, everything had changed. His beloved wife Rose, his partner of 52 years, had fallen ill. The doctors had done everything they could, but the medical bills piled up faster than autumn leaves. By the time she passed away, their modest savings had vanished. The house they had called home for decades had to be sold to cover the remaining debt. Now all Harold had was a tiny apartment, a meager pension that barely covered rent and his memories. He stopped in front of Maxime's, one of the fanciest restaurants in the city. Through the frosted glass, he could see the soft glow of chandeliers and the flicker of candles on white tablecloths. His eyes, however, were drawn to something in the corner of the room. A beautiful grand piano, its polished black surface gleaming like a midnight lake. Harold's heart ached at the sight. How long had it been since he had touched a piano? The community center where he used to practice had closed down 6 months ago. His fingers twitched at his sides, remembering the feel of ivory keys beneath them. A crazy idea began to form in his mind. No, he muttered to himself, shaking his head. They'll just throw you out. But as another gust of icy wind cut through his coat and his stomach cramped with hunger, the idea refused to leave. What did he have to lose? His pride? That was about all he had left anyway. Drawing a deep breath, Harold straightened his back as best he could, brushed some snow from his sleeve, and pushed open the heavy door of Maxime's. Warmth and the smell of delicious food enveloped him immediately. The restaurant buzzed with conversation and the gentle clink of silverware against fine china. A young man in a crisp black suit approached with a polite but wary smile. "Can I help you, sir?" the maitre d' asked, his eyes quickly taking in Harold's threadbare coat and worn gloves. Harold cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how out of place he must look in such an elegant establishment. I noticed your piano," he said, his voice quavering slightly. "I was wondering if I could play for you, in exchange for a meal?" The maitre d's eyebrows rose. He opened his mouth to reply when a loud, booming laugh cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant. "You want to play for your dinner, old man? Is this a joke?" The voice belonged to a large man seated at a corner table with several well-dressed companions. He stood up, adjusting his expensive suit jacket, and walked toward Harold with the confidence of someone who owned the place, which, as it turned out, he did. "I'm Alexander Renault," the man said, not bothering to offer his hand. "This is my restaurant, and we don't run a charity here. We hire professional musicians." The other diners had grown quiet, many turning to watch the scene unfolding. Harold felt heat rise to his cheeks, but he stood his ground, one hand gripping his walking cane for support. "I understand, sir," Harold replied with quiet dignity. "But I was a professional musician, for most of my life, actually." Alexander's eyes narrowed as he studied the old man before him. "Is that so? And what are you doing begging for food instead of playing Carnegie Hall?" He chuckled at his own joke, and several nearby diners laughed nervously. Harold swallowed hard. He could feel everyone's eyes on him, some curious, others embarrassed for him. He thought about turning around and walking back into the cold night. But then he thought of Rose, and how she had always encouraged him to stand tall even when life knocked him down. "Life takes unexpected turns, Mr. Renault," Harold said simply. "I had a good career once. Then my wife got sick and, well, medical bills changed things." Something flickered across Alexander's face, perhaps a brief moment of empathy, but it quickly disappeared behind his smug expression. "Tell you what," Alexander said, folding his arms across his chest. "Play something for us. If you're as good as you claim, you can have dinner. If not, he gestured toward the door. Harold nodded, relief washing over him. Thank you for the chance. The maitre d' looked uncertain but led Harold to the piano at Alexander's nod. Conversations resumed around the restaurant, though many eyes still watched the old man as he settled onto the bench. Harold removed his worn gloves carefully. His hands weren't what they used to be, the knuckles swollen and the skin spotted with age. But they still knew their way around a keyboard. He flexed his fingers a few times, wincing slightly at the stiffness. The piano was magnificent, a Steinway concert grand that probably cost more than Harold had earned in years of teaching piano lessons. He placed his fingers gently on the keys, feeling their cool smoothness, and closed his eyes for a moment. What should he play? Something flashy to impress them? Something popular that they might recognize? No. If this was to be his audition for a meal, he would play what was in his heart. Harold began with the opening notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. The piece started softly, almost hesitantly, like a question being asked. His arthritic fingers moved with surprising agility, years of muscle memory taking over. As the music flowed from simple to complex, Harold forgot about his hunger, forgot about the cold outside, forgot about the eyes watching him. He was lost in the music, in the story it told, a tale of hope and despair, of light and darkness, of love and loss. The restaurant grew quieter with each passing moment. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. Even the kitchen staff peeked through the swinging doors to listen. When the piece reached its passionate climax, Harold's hands moved across the keys with the speed and precision that had once made critics call him a national treasure. The final notes rang out, powerful and resonant, before fading into a silence so complete you could hear the snow falling outside. Harold sat still for a moment, eyes still closed, hands resting lightly on the keys. Then, slowly, he became aware of his surroundings again, and the utter silence that had fallen over Maxime's. He turned on the bench, uncertain what to expect. The first thing he saw was Alexander Renault's face, all traces of smugness gone, replaced by an expression of complete astonishment. Then the restaurant erupted in applause. People stood from their tables, clapping enthusiastically. An elderly woman wiped tears from her eyes. A young waiter was shaking his head in disbelief. Alexander approached the piano slowly, as if seeing Harold for the first time. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice lacking its earlier mocking tone. "Really?" Harold smiled tiredly. "I told you, sir. I was a professional musician. Harold Weber is my name. I played with the Chicago Symphony for 30 years. A woman at a nearby table gasped audibly. "Harold Weber? The Harold Weber? I have your recording of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. You performed with orchestras all over the world." Alexander's face had turned slightly pale. "Why didn't you say so?" "Would it have mattered?" Harold asked gently. "When a hungry old man asks to play for food, does his name change his need?" The restaurant had grown quiet again, but this time with a different quality, a kind of respectful attention. Alexander cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "Well, Mr. Weber, I believe I owe you dinner. The chef's special tonight is filet mignon." He gestured to the maître d'. "Thomas will show you to my table. You'll be my guest." As Harold rose shakily from the piano bench, his legs stiff from sitting, he was met with another round of applause. People reached out to shake his hand as he made his way through the restaurant. A young girl asked for his autograph on her napkin. For the first time in months, Harold felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the restaurant's heating system. It was the warmth of being seen, truly seen, not as a burden or a charity case, but as an artist. As himself, he didn't know what tomorrow would bring. The cold would still be there, and his empty refrigerator and his mounting bills. But tonight, for a little while, he was Harold Weber, pianist extraordinaire, once again. And as he sat down at Alexander Renault's table, noticing how the millionaire now watched him with curious respect instead of disdain, Harold had the strange feeling that perhaps this wasn't the end of his story after all. Perhaps it was just the beginning of a new chapter. Harold sat across from Alexander at the corner table, trying not to stare too long at the steaming plate of food in front of him. The filet mignon was cooked to perfection, accompanied by roasted potatoes and asparagus drizzled with hollandaise sauce. The aroma alone made his mouth water. but years of performing at high-class venues had taught him manners that poverty couldn't erase. "Please eat," Alexander said, taking a sip of his red wine. "You must be hungry." Harold nodded gratefully and cut a small piece of the tender meat. The flavor exploded in his mouth, and he had to fight the urge to devour everything at once. It had been so long since he'd tasted food this good. "So," Alexander continued, watching Harold with newfound interest. "The Harold Weber. I should have recognized your name." He shook his head. "My mother was a huge fan of yours. She had all your recordings." Harold smiled between careful bites. "That's very kind. It's been a while since anyone recognized me. What happened? If you don't mind me asking." Alexander leaned forward. The arrogance that had colored his voice earlier was gone, replaced by genuine curiosity. "From international acclaim to—" He gestured vaguely, then seemed to think better of it. Harold set down his fork for a moment. "Life, Mr. Renault, just life. Alexander, please. Life, Alexander." Harold took a sip of water. "My wife Rose got sick about 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. Even with insurance, the treatments were expensive. Experimental procedures that might have saved her weren't covered." His voice grew soft. "I would have spent every penny I had if it meant saving her. In the end, I did. But it wasn't enough." A heavy silence fell between them. At nearby tables, diners continued their conversations, unaware of the painful history being shared in their midst. "I'm sorry," Alexander said finally, and he seemed to mean it. "And after she passed, I sold our house to pay off the remaining medical debt. Found a small apartment I could afford on my pension. I was going to start teaching piano again, but—" Harold held up his hands, showing the swollen joints and slight tremor. "Arthritis. It's better on some days than others. Today is a good day, thankfully." Alexander nodded thoughtfully. "Yet you can still play like that." He gestured toward the piano. "I've heard professionals who couldn't touch what you just did." A hint of pride flashed across Harold's weathered face. "The hands remember even when they hurt. 70 years of playing leaves its mark on you. It becomes part of who you are." As they continued their meal, Alexander asked about Harold's career, seeming genuinely interested in the old man's stories. Harold spoke of performing with the greatest orchestras in the world, of meeting presidents and royalty, of standing ovations that lasted 15 minutes. "I remember a concert in Vienna," Harold said, his eyes bright with the memory. The hall was packed. We played Beethoven's Emperor Concerto. When we finished the final movement, the audience erupted. People were crying. An old woman fought her way backstage afterward just to kiss my hand." He chuckled. She said her grandfather had played for Liszt himself, and she wanted to touch the hands that made such beautiful music. Alexander was captivated. This fragile old man who had been ready to throw out just an hour ago had lived a life most could only dream of. He'd touched thousands of lives with his art, brought beauty into a sometimes dark world. "And now?" Alexander asked softly. Harold's smile faded. "Now I try to survive. My apartment building has a small lounge with an upright piano. The owner lets me play sometimes when no one else is using the room. The community center where I used to practice closed down last year. Budget cuts." He sighed. "I miss it. The feeling of losing yourself in music." Before Alexander could respond, a middle-aged couple approached their table timidly. "Excuse me," the woman said. "Are you really Harold Weber?" "The pianist." Harold nodded, a little embarrassed by the attention. "I saw you perform Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1 with the Boston Symphony in 1987. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Her eyes welled up with tears. "Would you mind? Could I possibly have your autograph?" She held out a napkin, and Harold took it with slightly trembling hands. Alexander offered him a pen. "To whom should I make it out?" Harold asked. "Nancy. And my husband, George." Harold signed with a flourish, his handwriting still elegant despite his age. "Thank you," Nancy said, clutching the napkin like a precious gem. "You don't know what this means to us." As the couple walked away, Alexander noticed that other diners were stealing glances at their table, whispering to each other. Word had spread about who was sitting in their midst. "Looks like you've got some fans," Alexander observed. Harold shrugged. "People have good memories sometimes." They finished their meal, and Harold couldn't remember food ever tasting so good. When Alexander offered dessert, He almost declined out of politeness, but then accepted a slice of chocolate cake that melted in his mouth. "I have a question for you," Alexander said as they sipped their coffee. "A business proposition, actually." Harold raised an eyebrow. "A business proposition for me?" Alexander nodded, leaning forward. "I recently purchased the old Blackstone Hotel on Michigan Avenue. Do you know it?" "Of course. It's a Chicago landmark. Rose and I attended a New Year's Eve ball there once years ago. I'm renovating it completely, restoring it to its former glory." Alexander's eyes gleamed with excitement. "The dining room had a tradition of live piano music every evening. I want to bring that back." Harold set down his coffee cup, his hand suddenly unsteady. "Are you offering me a job, Alexander?" "Yes, as our resident pianist." Alexander named a salary that made Harold blink in surprise. 6 nights a week, 4 hours each evening. We'd provide dinner, of course. And benefits. Harold stared at him, speechless. Was this really happening? Or had he fallen asleep on a park bench somewhere and was dreaming this whole evening? I don't know what to say," he stammered finally. "Say yes." Alexander smiled. "You'd be perfect. The guests would love it, especially once word gets out about who's playing, and—" He hesitated, looking almost embarrassed. "It seems wrong that someone with your talent should be worried about where their next meal is coming from." Harold felt a lump forming in his throat. "Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me." Alexander gazed at the piano across the room. "My mother loved classical music. She played a little herself, nothing professional. Every Sunday she'd put on one of your recordings while she made dinner." His voice grew softer. "She always said music was what made us human. That in a world full of ugliness, people who created beauty were performing a kind of magic." He turned back to Harold. "She would never forgive me if I let Harold Weber go hungry when I had the power to do something about it." Harold nodded slowly, understanding. Sometimes the kindness of strangers came from the most unexpected places, triggered by memories and connections you couldn't see. "When would you want me to start?" he asked. "The renovations won't be complete for another month, but—" Alexander pulled out his wallet and removed a business card and a checkbook. "I'd like to give you an advance. To help with your current situation." He wrote out a check and slid it across the table. Harold glanced at it and inhaled sharply. The amount was more than 3 months of his pension. "This is too much," he protested. Alexander waved away his objection. "Consider it an investment. I expect you to show up looking the part of a world-class pianist. New suit, haircut, the works." His eyes twinkled. "Can't have you playing at the Blackstone looking like you just wandered in off the street?" Harold couldn't help but laugh. "No, I suppose not." As the evening wound down, Alexander insisted on calling his driver to take Harold home. "It's too cold to walk and too late for the bus," he said firmly. Standing outside under the restaurant's awning waiting for the car, Harold looked at Alexander with wonder. "How different this evening turned out than I expected," he said softly. "I came here hoping for a simple meal," Alexander smiled. "And I never expected to hire a musical legend to play at my hotel." He extended his hand. "Life is full of surprises, isn't it, Mr. Weber?" Harold shook it firmly. "Indeed it is, Mr. Renault. Indeed it is." As the sleek black car pulled up to the curb, Harold felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not just for tomorrow or next week, but for the future. A chance to play again, to share his gift with others, to live with dignity. And it had all started with a desperate question. Can I play for food? Sometimes, he thought as he settled into the warm leather seat of the luxury car, the universe gives you exactly the answer you need, just not in the way you expected. The driver pulled away from Maxim's, and Harold watched as the restaurant's golden light receded in the window. Tomorrow would be the beginning of something new. His fingers itched to touch piano keys again, to practice and prepare. Music was calling him back home. The next morning, Harold awoke in his small apartment and sat up in bed, momentarily confused by the check on his nightstand. Had last night really happened? He picked up the check, running his thumb over Alexander Renault's bold signature. It wasn't a dream after all. For the first time in months, Harold didn't have to worry about choosing between paying the heating bill or buying groceries. He could do both and still have enough left for a decent suit and perhaps even a visit to the barber. He made himself a cup of tea, a luxury he usually rationed, and added a spoonful of honey. Another small indulgence. As he sipped it, He walked slowly to the window and looked out at the gray Chicago morning. Snow was falling again, but it didn't seem as threatening as it had yesterday. Harold's small apartment was neat but sparse. After selling the house, he'd kept only what would fit in this one-bedroom rental. His favorite reading chair, a few lamps, his books, and some photographs. The largest picture hanging on the wall above his second-hand dining table showed Harold and Rose on their 50th wedding anniversary. She was laughing, her head thrown back in joy as Harold kissed her cheek. "You wouldn't believe what happened last night, Rose," he said aloud to the photograph. Talking to Rose had become a habit since her passing. Sometimes it made the silence more bearable. "I got a job, playing piano again. Can you imagine?" Harold could almost hear her delighted response. She had been his biggest supporter, attending nearly every concert throughout his career, always sitting in the same spot when possible, third row just left of center, where he could spot her easily from the piano. He spent the morning making lists, things he needed to buy, bills to pay, music he should practice. His fingers were stiff from the cold and arthritis, but he flexed them gently, doing the exercises his doctor had recommended. Around noon, his phone rang, a rare occurrence these days. "Hello? Mr. Weber, this is Thomas from Maxim's restaurant. We spoke last night?" It was the maitre d' who had initially greeted Harold. "Yes, of course. Hello, Thomas. Mr. Renault asked me to call you. He'd like to know if you're free this afternoon to visit the Blackstone Hotel. He wants to show you the space where you'll be playing." Harold felt a flutter of excitement. "Yes, I'm free. What time should I be there?" "Mr. Renault's driver will pick you up at 2 o'clock if that suits you." After hanging up, Harold moved as quickly as his old bones would allow. He showered and put on his best clothes, which admittedly weren't very impressive. His good suit had been sold years ago, but he had a clean pair of slacks and a button-down shirt without any fraying at the cuffs. He polished his worn shoes until they gleamed as best they could. At precisely 2 o'clock, a sleek black car pulled up outside his building. The driver, a friendly man named Paul, helped Harold into the back seat. "Mr. Renault speaks very highly of you, sir," Paul said as they drove through the snowy streets. "Said you're the best pianist he's ever heard." Harold chuckled. "That's very kind of him, though I suspect he hasn't heard many pianists." Paul shook his head. "Don't be so sure. His mother was big into classical music. Took him to concerts all the time when he was a kid, from what I understand." Man knows his stuff. This surprised Harold. Alexander had mentioned his mother's love of music, but not that he'd been exposed to it from a young age. Perhaps there was more to the brash businessman than met the eye. The Blackstone Hotel stood proudly on Michigan Avenue, its historic facade covered partially by scaffolding. Even under renovation, the building maintained its dignified air, a reminder of Chicago's Gilded Age. Paul pulled up to a side entrance where Alexander was waiting, bundled in a heavy coat. "Harold, right on time." Alexander shook his hand warmly. Come in, come in. Watch your step. It's a bit of a construction zone." Inside the hotel was a flurry of activity. Workers in hard hats moved purposefully through the lobby, carrying tools and materials. Plastic sheets protected ornate moldings, and the smell of fresh paint hung in the air. "We're restoring all the original details," Alexander explained as they carefully made their way through the chaos. The Blackstone was one of the grandest hotels in America when it opened in 1910. Presidents stayed here, movie stars, the Beatles even. He led Harold past the reception area to a set of tall double doors. "And this," he said with a flourish, pushing them open, "will be the crown room." Harold gasped softly as they entered. Despite the drop cloths and scaffolding, the dining room was magnificent. Soaring ceilings with intricate plasterwork, tall windows overlooking Grant Park and Lake Michigan beyond, crystal chandeliers carefully wrapped in protective covering waiting to be unveiled. "It's beautiful," Harold murmured. "It will be," Alexander agreed. "We're bringing back all the original details but with modern amenities." He walked to the far corner of the room, where a platform was being constructed. "And this is where you'll be." Harold approached the platform slowly. It was the perfect spot, visible from the entire dining room but not intrusive. "The piano arrives next week," Alexander continued. "A Steinway concert grand. Black, of course, to match the room's color scheme." Harold nodded, picturing it. He could almost feel the keys beneath his fingers, hear the music filling this grand space. What do you think? Alexander asked, watching him closely. I think it's perfect, Harold replied honestly. Absolutely perfect, Alexander smiled, pleased. I have another surprise for you. Follow me. They took an elevator to the 10th floor. Alexander led him down a freshly painted hallway to a corner room. He unlocked the door and gestured for Harold to enter first. It was a suite, not overly large but elegantly appointed with a small living area, bedroom, and bathroom. The windows offered the same stunning view of the lake as the dining room below. This is one of our resident suites, Alexander explained, typically reserved for visiting executives or guests staying for extended periods. He handed Harold a key. It's yours if you want it. Harold stared at him, uncomprehending. Mine? Part of your compensation package? You mentioned your apartment was small and I thought… Alexander shrugged, suddenly looking a bit uncomfortable. It would be convenient. You'd be right here for your performances. No need to travel in bad weather. Harold walked slowly to the window, overwhelmed. Just yesterday he had been wondering if he could afford to keep his heat on through the winter. Now he was being offered a suite in one of Chicago's most prestigious hotels. I don't know what to say, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Say yes, Alexander replied simply. It makes good business sense. Having you on site, being able to promote that Harold Weber lives and performs exclusively at the Blackstone, it's good marketing. Harold turned, seeing through the business justification to the kindness beneath it. Thank you, Alexander. I accept. They continued the tour, with Alexander showing him the hotel's other amenities, the bar being restored to its Prohibition-era glory, the small ballroom where private events would be held, the lobby where a Christmas tree would soon stand. As they walked, Alexander introduced Harold to key staff members, the head chef, the hotel manager, the head of housekeeping. Everyone was polite, though Harold could tell some were curious about who this elderly man was and why the boss was treating him with such respect. Mr. Weber will be our resident pianist when we reopen, Alexander explained each time. He was once the principal pianist for the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. The reactions varied from polite nods to genuine awe, especially from a young woman named Lily, the events coordinator, who turned out to be a trained pianist herself. I studied your recording of Liszt's Transcendental Etudes in college, she told Harold, her eyes wide with admiration. I can't believe you'll be playing here. Wait until I tell my old professor. By the time they finished the tour, Harold was tired but exhilarated. It felt like stepping back in time to when his name opened doors, when people recognized his talent. But there was something different now, a humility that came from knowing how quickly it could all disappear. So, Alexander said as they stood in the lobby, preparing to leave. What do you think? Still want the job? Harold smiled. More than ever. Good. The hotel reopens in 3 weeks with a grand gala. The mayor will be there, some celebrities, the usual crowd. Alexander clasped his hands behind his back. I'd like you to be the centerpiece of the entertainment. A special performance to announce your residency. Harold felt a flutter of nervousness. It had been years since he'd performed for such a distinguished audience. His hands weren't what they once were, but the opportunity to play again in such a setting… I would be honored, he said. Alexander nodded, pleased. Excellent. Paul will take you home now. And Harold? He reached into his pocket and handed him a credit card. Get yourself whatever you need. Clothes, sheet music, anything. Consider it an advance on your first month. As Paul drove him back to his apartment, Harold felt like he was floating. Just 24 hours ago, he had been a forgotten old man, worried about his next meal. Now he was preparing for a comeback performance at one of Chicago's most prestigious venues. Life could change in an instant. Sometimes for the worse, as he'd learned when Rose got sick. But sometimes, if you were lucky, for the better. The only thing he knew for certain was that he needed to start practicing immediately. His fingers might be old and stiff, but they still knew how to dance across the keys, and soon they would dance again. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur for Harold. After cashing Alexander's check, he first paid his overdue bills and then set about preparing for his new life. He bought 2 new suits, dress shirts, ties, and proper shoes. The tailor, an older Italian man named Giuseppe, treated him with special care after learning he was a pianist. My father loved classical music, Giuseppe said as he measured Harold's arms. He would play records on Sundays after church. Always the piano concerts. Harold also visited Dr. Chen, his doctor, who was delighted to hear about the job opportunity. "This is wonderful news, Mr. Weber," she said, examining his hands. "Regular playing will be good for your arthritis, actually. Just don't overdo it at first. Your hands need to build up stamina again." She prescribed a new medication that might help with the pain, and showed him some additional exercises to improve flexibility in his fingers. Harold left the clinic feeling more hopeful than he had in years. Most importantly, he needed to practice. The community center where he used to play had closed, but Harold found a solution at a nearby church. The music director, a kind woman named Beth, agreed to let him use their piano during weekday afternoons when the sanctuary was empty. "I've heard of you, Mr. Weber," she said, unlocking the doors for him on his first day. "My grandfather had your recording of the Grieg piano concerto. He played it until the vinyl wore out." Harold smiled gratefully. "Thank you for this opportunity, Beth. I promise not to disturb anyone." "Disturb?" She laughed. "Everyone will be thrilled to have music filling this space. Play as long as you like." And so Harold played day after day. At first his fingers were clumsy and stiff, unable to move as quickly as his mind remembered they should. The pain sometimes made him wince and stop. But slowly, like an athlete training after an injury, his hands began to remember. The muscle memory built over decades of performance came back, bit by bit. He chose his program for the opening gala carefully. He wanted pieces that would showcase his abilities, but also accommodate the limitations of his aging hands. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major for its dreamy beauty, Debussy's Clair de Lune for its delicate touch, and for his finale, Rhapsody in Blue by Gershwin, a piece that would appeal to a broader audience while still demonstrating virtuosity. On his third day of practice, Harold became aware of someone sitting in the back pew of the church. He finished the passage he was working on and turned to see Beth with tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping her cheeks. "I didn't mean to interrupt. It's just, I've never heard it played that way before." "Like you're telling a story," Harold nodded. "That's exactly what it is. Every piece of music is a story. My job is to tell it as truthfully as I can." As the days passed, word spread. Church members began to find reasons to visit during his practice times. Beth's music students would sit silently, watching his hands with awe. An elderly parishioner brought him homemade cookies and sat through an entire 2-hour session, her eyes closed in bliss. Meanwhile, Alexander called regularly with updates about the hotel. The piano had arrived, a magnificent Steinway that had been specially selected by a consultant from the Chicago Symphony. The dining room renovations were nearly complete. Reservations were flooding in for the opening night. "The mayor confirmed he's attending," Alexander told Harold excitedly. "And the governor might come too. Several music critics from major papers. This is going to be huge, Harold." With 1 week to go, Harold moved into his suite at the Blackstone. He brought little with him: his clothes, books, and the precious photographs of Rose. The suite had been prepared beautifully, with fresh flowers on the coffee table and a small upright piano against one wall. "For practicing between performances," Alexander explained during a quick tour. "Though you're welcome to use the grand in the dining room during the day when it's closed." Harold ran his fingers over the upright's keys. It was a quality instrument, perfectly in tune. "This is very thoughtful, Alexander." "Thank you." The hotel staff welcomed him warmly, treating him with a respect he hadn't experienced in years. The head chef, a Frenchman named Philippe, insisted on personally discussing meal options for Harold. "You must keep up your strength for playing," Philippe said. "I will make sure you have proper nutrition." The housekeeping staff was equally attentive, led by a grandmotherly woman named Irene, who reminded Harold a bit of Rose with her no-nonsense approach to caring for others. "You let me know if you need anything at all, Mr. Weber," she told him. "Extra pillows, special soap for your hands, anything." For the first time since Rose's passing, Harold felt like he belonged somewhere. He was part of a community again. The night before the grand opening, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the window of his suite, looking out at the glittering Chicago skyline and the dark expanse of Lake Michigan beyond. Nerves fluttered in his stomach, the familiar pre-performance butterflies he hadn't felt in years. "I wish you were here, Rose," he whispered. "You always knew what to say before a big concert." He could almost hear her response. "You'll be magnificent, my love." "You always are." Morning came too quickly. The hotel buzzed with final preparations for the evening gala. Florists arranged elaborate displays in the lobby. Staff polished every surface until it gleamed. Caterers wheeled in carts loaded with delicacies. Harold spent the morning in his suite, going through his hand exercises and mentally reviewing his program. At noon, Alexander knocked on his door, looking uncharacteristically nervous in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Anything you need?" Harold smiled at this reversal, the wealthy businessman checking on him instead of the other way around. "I'm fine, Alexander. Just focusing on tonight," Alexander nodded. "The piano's been tuned again this morning. I had them adjust the bench height like you asked. The lighting has been set exactly as you requested." He hesitated. "I know I don't need to tell you this, but this means a lot to me, Harold. Having someone of your caliber performing here, I won't let you down," Harold promised. As evening approached, Harold dressed carefully in his new tuxedo. His reflection in the mirror surprised him. He looked distinguished, professional. The scared, hungry old man who had walked into Maxim's that snowy night was gone. In his place stood Harold Weber, concert pianist. At precisely 7 o'clock, Harold made his way down to the crown room. Guests in formal attire were already filling the space, admiring the restored details and elegant decor. The chandelier crystals sparkled overhead and the wall sconces cast a warm golden glow. At the far end of the room, the Steinway gleamed under perfectly positioned lights. Alexander met him at the entrance, beaming with pride. "Magnificent, isn't it? Just like in its heyday?" Harold nodded, taking it all in. "It's perfect, Alexander. Absolutely perfect. Let me introduce you to some people before your performance." What followed was a whirlwind of handshakes and exclamations of surprise. "The Harold Weber?" was a common refrain, followed by stories of concerts attended decades ago or beloved recordings. The mayor, a music lover himself, was particularly enthusiastic. "My father took me to hear you play Tchaikovsky when I was just 10 years old," he told Harold. "It inspired me to take piano lessons. I wasn't very good," he added with a laugh, "but my appreciation for music has stayed with me my whole life." A famous violinist who happened to be in town for a performance with the symphony approached Harold with genuine respect. "It's an honor to meet you, Maestro Weber," she said, bowing slightly. "Your recording of the Brahms concerto was what made me want to become a musician." By the time Harold made his way to the piano, he felt buoyed by the warm reception. This wasn't just a job or a chance to earn a living. It was a homecoming. Alexander stepped onto the small platform beside the piano and tapped a spoon against his champagne glass. The room gradually fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "welcome to the grand reopening of the historic Blackstone Hotel's Crown Room." Applause filled the space. "We have restored this magnificent venue to its former glory, and in keeping with its rich tradition of musical excellence, I am honored to introduce our resident pianist." He turned to Harold with genuine admiration. Many of you may remember him from his decades with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Some of you may have his recordings in your collections. All of you are in for a treat tonight. He raised his glass. "Please join me in welcoming the legendary Harold Weber." The applause was deafening. Harold stood and bowed slightly, then settled himself at the piano. He adjusted the bench, flexed his fingers, and took a deep breath. For a moment, doubt crept in. Could he really do this? His hands weren't what they once were. The pain was better with the new medication, but still present. What if he faltered? What if he disappointed all these people? What if he disappointed Alexander, who had given him this second chance? Then he looked up and just for a second thought he saw Rose sitting in her usual spot, third row just left of center. She wasn't there, of course, but the memory of her unwavering support steadied him. Harold placed his fingers on the keys and began to play. As Harold's fingers touched the keys, the world around him faded away. There was no audience, no pressure, no pain in his joints, just the music. He began with Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the gentle notes floating across the crown room like a lullaby. The piece was deceptively simple, but Harold knew that its beauty lay in the subtle changes of tempo and dynamics, in the emotional truth behind each note. He allowed himself to be vulnerable in his playing, channeling all the loneliness of the past 3 years, all the grief of losing Rose, all the humiliation of poverty, but also the renewed hope, the gratitude, the joy of sitting at a magnificent piano once again. The audience was utterly silent. No coughs, no whispers, no clinking of glasses, just pure attention. Harold could feel their focus like a physical presence supporting and lifting him. When the final notes of the nocturne faded, there was a moment of complete stillness before the applause began. Harold didn't pause to acknowledge it, but moved directly into Clair de Lune. The Debussy piece was like painting with sound, creating images of moonlight dancing on water, of stillness and gentle movement. Harold's touch was delicate, precise, each note placed exactly where it needed to be. Though his fingers weren't as nimble as they had been in his prime, decades of experience had taught him how to compensate. Where once he might have relied on technical brilliance, now he leaned on his deep understanding of the music, his ability to convey emotion through the slightest variations in touch and timing. Again, when he finished, the applause was thunderous. Harold took a moment to wipe his brow with a handkerchief and flex his fingers. The final piece, Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, would be the most challenging. It required more physical stamina, more technical prowess, but it was also a piece that celebrated life, with all its chaos and beauty, its struggles and triumphs. Harold took a deep breath and began. The opening clarinet-like glissando swept upward, and then his hands were dancing across the keyboard, bringing to life Gershwin's vision of America, the pulse of city streets, the wail of jazz clubs, the rumble of trains, the quieter moments of reflection. As he played, Harold's mind filled with images from his own life, performing in grand concert halls around the world, holding Rose's hand as they walked through Paris, standing in the rain at her funeral, the emptiness of his tiny apartment, the desperation that had led him to Maxime's that snowy night, Alexander's initial mockery and subsequent kindness, and now this moment of redemption, the piece built to its final triumphant conclusion, Harold's hands stretching for chords that once would have been easy, but now required every ounce of his strength and will. As the final notes rang out, Harold felt a curious sense of peace. Whatever happened next, he had done it. He had played with everything he had. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then the crown room erupted. People leapt to their feet, applauding, cheering, some wiping tears from their eyes. Harold stood shakily and turned to face them, bowing deeply. Alexander rushed to the piano, his face alight with emotion. "Magnificent," he said, embracing Harold. "Absolutely magnificent." The mayor was next, pumping Harold's hand. "I had forgotten what genius sounds like," he said. "Thank you for reminding us all." For the next hour, Harold was surrounded by well-wishers. Music critics promised glowing reviews. A record producer handed him a card, mentioning the possibility of a new recording. Former colleagues from the symphony reminisced about performances decades past. Through it all, Harold maintained a quiet dignity, grateful but not overwhelmed. This world had once been his everyday reality. While he appreciated its return, he also carried with him now the perspective that comes from having lost it all. As the evening wound down, Harold found a quiet corner to rest his tired hands. Beth, the church music director who had allowed him to practice, approached with an elderly man. "Mr. Weber," she said, "this is my grandfather, Thomas. He's the one who wore out your vinyl recording of the Grieg Concerto. When I told him you'd be playing tonight, he insisted on coming." Thomas, who must have been well into his 90s, gripped Harold's hand with surprising strength. "I never thought I'd get to hear you play in person," he said, his voice quavering with age. It was worth the wait. Harold was touched. "Thank you for coming, Thomas. Music connects us across time, doesn't it? Those recordings I made 50 years ago, they're still reaching people." Thomas nodded. "That's the magic of it. When you play, it's not just notes. It's life itself." Later, as the final guest departed, Alexander found Harold sitting at the piano again, softly playing a simple melody. "What's that?" Alexander asked, sitting beside him on the bench. "I don't recognize it. It's nothing famous," Harold replied. "Just a little tune I composed for Rose on our first anniversary. I used to play it for her every year on that day." Alexander listened, his usual brashness subdued. "It's beautiful. You should record it." Harold shook his head. "Some things aren't meant for the public. This one was just for her." He finished the melody and closed the piano lid gently. "Thank you for tonight, Alexander." "For everything." Alexander cleared his throat, seeming almost embarrassed. "It was just good business. Having a pianist of your caliber will put the Blackstone on the map again." Harold smiled, seeing through the gruff exterior to the unexpected kindness beneath. "Of course. Good business." The next morning, Harold woke early, his fingers slightly stiff but his heart light. He made himself a cup of tea and carried it to the window of his suite, looking out at Lake Michigan shimmering in the dawn light. His phone rang, another rarity before all this began. "Hello? Mr. Weber, this is Lily from the hotel events office. I hope I'm not calling too early." "Not at all, Lily. I've been up for a while. I wanted to let you know we've already received 16 requests for private events where you're specifically mentioned as the pianist, and the dining room is fully booked for the next 2 weeks." Her voice was excited. "People are coming specifically to hear you play." After hanging up, Harold sipped his tea and thought about how quickly life could change. Just 1 month ago, he had been standing outside Maxim's hungry and desperate, gathering the courage to ask if he could play for food. Now he had a home, a purpose, and music in his life again. 6 months later, Harold's residency at the Blackstone had become one of Chicago's most talked-about cultural attractions. The Crown Room was booked solid every night with people making reservations weeks in advance. Music lovers from across the country came to hear the legendary pianist who had returned from obscurity. Harold kept a regular schedule, playing 4 hours each evening, with Mondays off to rest. His hands had grown stronger with regular playing, and though the arthritis would never fully disappear, Dr. Chen's treatments helped manage the pain. Alexander's investment had paid off handsomely. The Blackstone was once again one of Chicago's premier hotels, with Harold's presence adding a touch of cultural cachet that set it apart from competitors. But more meaningful to Harold than the professional success was the community he had found. The hotel staff had become like family. Alexander, despite his continued insistence that it was just business, had become a true friend, often sitting at the piano after closing to hear Harold play and share stories. On Sunday afternoons, Harold had begun offering free lessons to gifted young pianists who couldn't afford proper instruction. Lily from the events office had helped organize this, discovering that Harold's reputation as a teacher was nearly as legendary as his performing career. "You don't have to do this, you know," Alexander had said when he learned of the lessons. "You're already working 6 nights a week." Harold had simply smiled. "When I was 7 years old, a concert pianist heard me playing on an old upright in my school auditorium. Instead of walking by, he stopped and gave me my first real lesson. Later, he arranged a scholarship for me to study properly." He flexed his fingers thoughtfully. "Music is a gift that's meant to be passed on." One evening, nearly a year after his first night at Maxim's, Harold was playing a particularly moving rendition of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata when he noticed an elderly man sitting alone at a table near the piano. Something in the man's expression, a mixture of hunger and longing, struck Harold deeply. It was a look he recognized from his own reflection during those difficult days after Rose's passing. When Harold finished his set, he approached the man's table. "Excuse me," he said gently. "I couldn't help noticing how intently you were listening. Are you a musician yourself?" The man looked up, surprised to be addressed by the pianist. "I was once, violin, nothing famous like you, just local orchestras." He gestured to his gnarled hands. "Arthritis ended all that." Harold nodded in understanding. "I know something about that particular challenge." He held out his own hand. "I'm Harold Weber." "I know who you are," the man said with a small smile. "Everyone knows now. I'm Daniel. Would you join me for dinner, Daniel? I'd love to hear about your music." As they shared a meal, Harold learned that Daniel was a widower like himself, struggling with loneliness and purpose. He had come to the Blackstone not because he could afford it, but because he had read about Harold in the newspaper and scraped together enough money for one drink just to hear him play. "Your story inspired me," Daniel admitted. "The newspaper called it a comeback for the ages." Harold smiled. "Would you like to hear the real story? Not the newspaper version?" Daniel nodded eagerly, and so over dinner, Harold told him about that desperate night, about asking to play for food, about Alexander's mockery and subsequent kindness, about second chances and the unexpected ways they arrive. When they finished eating, Harold glanced at the clock. His break was almost over. Soon he would need to return to the piano for his final set of the evening. "Daniel," he said thoughtfully, "do you still have your violin?" Daniel nodded. "I can't really play it anymore, but I couldn't bear to part with it." Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out one of his cards. something he still wasn't used to having again. Bring it next Monday. It's my day off. Perhaps we could try some simple duets. Music can be adapted just as we've had to adapt. As Daniel's eyes lit up with hope, Harold thought about the endless circle of giving and receiving, of falling and rising again. He had asked to play for food out of desperation, never imagining where it would lead. Now he could offer something similar to another musician in need, not just a meal, but connection, purpose, respect. Sometimes, he reflected as he returned to the piano for his final set, the most beautiful music comes from the broken places, and sometimes a simple question asked in your darkest moment can lead to the most unexpected and beautiful answer.